Step into a galaxy where unexpected bonds can alter destiny in the blink of an eye. Our story follows Grant, a roguish pilot, and Celia, an aristocrat with cosmic powers, who find themselves forced into a life-altering ritual. Imagine unlocking mystical energy cuffs on a rescue mission, only to discover you've accidentally ignited an ancient marriage bond. How do they cope with new powers, a sprawling empire, and scheming rivals who wish to tear them apart? If you're curious to learn whether they can break free or wield that bond to reshape the empire, then you won't want to miss a single moment of this thrilling sci-fi adventure. Please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of our amazing stories. Join us on this wild ride and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Grant Cade had always believed that life on the fringes of the galaxy taught you one crucial skill: adaptability. Drifting from one starport to another, he had become a master at spotting opportunities and exploiting them before anyone else realized there was money to be made. On the outer reaches of the Midoriya system, he found himself in the kind of place where opportunities, no matter how shady, practically oozed from every corner. The Sundered Comet was a notorious establishment suspended in orbit around a battered moon, a dimly lit bar where broken deals, broken hearts, and sometimes broken bones were served up nightly alongside cheap fluorescent drinks. He never planned to linger in such dives for long, but quick cash often lured him in. On that particular evening, the bar's neon sign flickered ominously, as if it were trying to warn him to turn away. But Grant was already stepping through the doors, scanning the crowd of unsavory patrons with practiced ease. Grav truckers, black market dealers, and even a few rogue mercenaries. All the usual suspects squabbled over rigged card games or discreetly discussed contraband. The mix of stale alcohol fumes and the distant hiss of coolant leaks painted a picture Grant knew far too well. A place where you could find exactly the kind of job that paid a lot for a little. At least, that was the promise. He settled at the bar, ordering a drink that promised to be half synth whiskey, half questionable water from the ice rings of some far-off planet. Leaning against the scuffed metal counter, he let his dark hair fall into his eyes and tried not to think about the failing reactor on his own ship, the Wayward Sun. The cost of overhauling that rust bucket was piling up, and he needed a payday fast. He was halfway through the drink, wincing at its metallic aftertaste, when a hooded figure took the stool beside him without invitation. Despite the figure's bulky cloak, Grant noticed the subtle hum of a personal shield generator. Whoever this person was, they had money to burn. No one on the edges of Midoriya carried that kind of gear without substantial resources backing them up. The figure slid a small data chip across the bar without a word. Grant eyed it warily before picking it up. A flick of his thumb activated a holographic display that danced just above the bar's grimy surface, projecting a sum of credits so large it made his pulse quicken. He flicked his gaze from the chip to the figure, whose face remained concealed in the shadows of their hood. "Where did you get this kind of money?" Grant asked, keeping his voice low. Experience had taught him that flamboyant displays of shock or greed drew attention, usually the wrong kind. The figure ignored the question. "It's a retrieval operation," they said, voice distorted by an electronic scrambler. "A simple grab and go. No heavy security, no complicated infiltration. You'll be in and out with none the wiser." Grant arched an eyebrow. "Retrieval of what exactly?" "Not what," the figure corrected. "Who? A noblewoman being held aboard a private vessel in deep space. You'll be given the coordinates, the passcodes, everything you need. Just get her out and you collect every last credit displayed there." Grant fought to keep his reaction neutral. He'd done shady extractions before. Wayward aristocrats, reclusive scientists, rebellious children of the wealthy who'd decided to flee their gilded cages. But something in the hooded figure's tone hinted at an unusual twist. Still, the number on that holographic display could fix the Wayward Sun's reactor 3 times over. Probably even buy him a better ship. Maybe a new life. It was exactly the sort of offer he would normally label too good to be true, yet he found himself listening intently for the details. "How sure are you this so-called noblewoman wants to leave?" he asked, draining the last of his drink. "Her family has strong political motivations to see her relocated. the figure replied cryptically. Suffice it to say, she's of no use to them in her current predicament. That's not really an answer. Grant wondered why he was pressing so hard. Maybe the wise part of him was still flailing in protest. Does it matter? You get in, you get her out, you get paid. The figure tapped the data chip. Coordinates included. That should be enough. With a final glance at the obscene credit total, Grant pocketed the chip. He knew this would probably blow up in his face. Jobs this profitable usually did. Yet his bones were tired of the constant hustle, and his ship's life support wasn't going to fix itself. For once, he was ready to gamble big. All right, he said, lowering his voice. I'm in. The hooded figure nodded, then stood to leave. You have no idea how relieved we are to hear that. Before Grant could press for clarification, the cloaked form vanished into the crowd, leaving him with only an uneasy feeling and a fortune in promised credits flickering on the holoscreen. The wayward son had seen better days, if it ever had any. Grant acquired her 2 years back from a desperate captain who gambled away most of his profits in illegal outer rim casinos. What remained of the ship was little more than a battered hull stitched together with layers of patchwork metal. Half of its original systems had been stripped out for spare parts, and the onboard AI was so glitchy it regularly insisted on random system checks mid-flight. The jump drive sometimes decided not to start, as though it too weighed the pros and cons of any given job. Yet for all its flaws, the wayward son was home. Grant had replaced the hyper-compressor coil with his own hands and carefully rewired the nav sensors for better stealth runs. Somewhere between near-fatal mechanical failures and frantic escapes from system patrols, he developed a certain fondness for his flying junk heap. He told himself that if he ever made it big, he'd buy a brand new ship and keep the wayward son in some museum as a testament to perseverance. But first, he had to keep her running. That meant the job he'd just accepted at the Sundered Comet was vital, though he still questioned his sanity in taking it. Before embarking on his new rescue mission, Grant took a few minutes to study the data chip in the privacy of his cramped cockpit. Flicking it on, he saw a rotating 3D image of what appeared to be a luxury space yacht, a far cry from the imposing fortress or prison station he'd expected. Its name was the Sovereign Pearl, a vessel known in aristocratic circles for hosting extravagant galas in zero-G ballrooms. The entire interior boasted genuine hardwood paneling and floating crystal chandeliers, or so the data suggested. This was not a standard detention site by any stretch of the imagination. He frowned, sliding a finger across the hollow to dig deeper. Noblewoman was an understatement. The target was listed as Celia Drothis, rumored to be connected to a powerful lineage in the Celestine Empire. Yet the records were glaringly incomplete, as if certain details had been intentionally purged. A few notes indicated some kind of familial conflict, but specifics were non-existent. Even more puzzling, the data packet contained infiltration codes that would supposedly grant him access to the Sovereign Pearl without raising alarms. Grant had handled enough infiltration gigs to know that was suspiciously convenient. Usually, top-tier aristocratic vessels included layers of security, biometric locks, telepathic scanning wards if you dealt with any psionically gifted families, and entire squads of private militia. But the file insisted on minimal or non-existent security for his target's quarters. It was an odd confluence of factors that made him reconsider the job more than once. Still, the promise of those credits and the shiny new future they could buy beckoned him forward. The only problem now was finding the Sovereign Pearl's exact location. The chip displayed coordinates in deep space near the edges of the Celestine Empire's official border. That was well outside typical trade routes, which would keep the job hidden from prying eyes, but also spiked Grant's wariness. Why park a luxury yacht in the middle of nowhere unless you had something to hide? Against his better judgment, he programmed the location into the wayward son's nav computer. The jump drive sputtered its usual complaints, but after a few ominous beeps, it locked on to the route. In a swirl of starlight, the old ship powered up for a short-range hyperspace hop. Settling into the pilot's chair, Grant took a moment to reflect on how precarious his situation was. He was about to board what amounted to a floating palace, pluck a high-born lady from her lavish accommodations, and then vanish without a trace. It all sounded too easy, and when a job sounded too easy, it was usually a trap. Just once, he muttered aloud. I'd like an easy payday that doesn't involve risking life and limb. The ship's AI emitted a crackle, which Grant interpreted as a sarcastic snort. He sighed, gripping the flight controls. Yeah, you and me both, friend. Seconds later, the swirling vortex of hyperspace swallowed the wayward sun, catapulting him into the unknown. Grant's first impression of the Sovereign Pearl was that it radiated an almost ostentatious aura. From the pilot's seat of the wayward sun, he watched his sensors register the immense vessel adrift in silent grandeur against the speckled canvas of space. Dozens of ornamental fins and shimmering solar sails adorned the hull, a testament to how unafraid its owners were of being noticed. This was a status symbol, a spaceship built less for efficiency and more for impressing fellow aristocrats and galaxy trotters. Strangely, there were no docking restrictions, no security vessels patrolling the perimeter. Grant half expected a squadron of fighter drones to converge and demand credentials, but nothing happened. The yacht just loomed there, regal and unbothered. Steeling his nerves, Grant guided the wayward sun toward a modest side hatch that the infiltration codes indicated as a maintenance entry. He extended the docking clamps. The moment his ship latched onto the yacht's hull, a low hiss echoed through the corridors behind him. Life support systems balancing the pressure between the two vessels. Slipping on a small pulse pistol holster, Grant crossed into the airlock, his heart pounding as he waited for the interior doors to cycle open. The data chip had promised no complications, but he knew better than to trust anything blindly. He stepped through the opening into a corridor lit by soft, ambient glow panels hidden behind carved wooden paneling. Real wood, or at least the most convincing synthetic veneer he'd ever seen. Plush carpeting embroidered with swirling designs ran the length of the corridor. Grant inched forward, expecting a hidden guard or a turret to spring out at any moment. Nothing moved. The yacht was eerily silent, save for the faint hum of its environmental systems. Where is everyone? He whispered. He had no illusions that a place like this would be abandoned. The promise of no security was simply ridiculous. Yet here he was, waltzing through a corridor so opulent it could have graced the cover of a Star Society lifestyle magazine. He checked the palm-sized scanner strapped to his forearm. According to the infiltration data, Celia Drothus's quarters lay 2 corridors away on Deck 5. He'd planned to disable guards and bypass locked doors, but each hatch he encountered slid open seamlessly at his presence, almost as if the ship had been programmed to let him roam. The only sign of possible resistance came in the form of small, hovering orbs that meandered through the corridors, scanning surfaces for dust and polishing them to a mirror finish. Maintenance droids, not security. Eventually, he reached a set of ornate double doors with filigree etched into their surfaces. This was the final stop, if his scanner was to be believed. Beneath the filigree, faint lines glowed, a biometric lock. He retrieved a small code stick from his belt and inserted it into the console. The lock beeped, then turned green. With a soft hiss, the doors slid apart, revealing a room draped in silks of shifting colors. Ambient music played softly, and intricate lighting cast prismatic patterns across plush couches and a levitating chaise. In the center of it all stood the so-called captive. Grant paused, breath-catching. Celia Drothus was not bound in steel chains or locked behind a force field. She stood in the middle of the lavish chamber wearing golden energy cuffs that pulsed faintly against her wrists, but she seemed more intrigued than restrained. Her skin held a pearlescent violet hue that caught the room's light, and her shimmering silver hair tumbled over her shoulders. When she turned to face him, her eyes, a startling shade of electric teal, glowed with an intensity that made him hesitate. "Well, hello there," she drawled, lifting one cuffed wrist in a lazy wave. "You must be the so-called savior I've been expecting." Grant froze, one hand drifting toward his pulse pistol, uncertain whether this was a trap. The woman across from him, princess or lady or whatever title she truly held, didn't flinch. Instead, she offered a slow, knowing smile that made him feel abruptly self-conscious about his scruffy clothes and unkempt hair. She carried herself with an eerie confidence, as though she were the hostess and he some late-arriving guest at a party. "Am I late?" he muttered, snapping his posture straight and trying to focus. He needed to think of her as a job, not as a stunning alien noble who seemed to radiate an otherworldly presence. She let out a brief musical laugh. I don't keep track of hours in this place. It's all the same pattern of starlight, day and night. Tapping her energy cuffs against one another, she arched an elegant brow. You wouldn't happen to have a universal key for these, would you? Actually, that's... He patted his belt, retrieving the specialized key he had been provided. Yes, but I need to confirm something first. Are you forcibly restrained? From the way she moved, it was hard to see the cuffs as a real hindrance. They seemed more ornamental than anything else. A small shrug lifted her shoulders. Forcibly is a matter of perspective. I can't remove these cuffs on my own, but I can still roam about this yacht freely so long as I cooperate with my caretaker, who apparently decided to vacate right before you showed up. Her eyes flicked downward, examining Grant with open curiosity. And you are? Grant Cade, he said reflexively. This was not how rescues typically went. There was no whimpering captive, no pleas for liberation. She seemed amused. Your family hired me to, facilitate your departure. At least that's the impression I was given. She exhaled softly, a sound that might have been a scoff. My family? The cynicism dripping from her words suggested a complicated relationship. All right, Mr. Grant Cade, if you're going to pop these restraints off me, go ahead. Let's see how serious you are about this rescue. Grant sensed something off. The job's briefing never mentioned Celia's attitude. It only described her predicament. He recalled the hooded figure's promise. No heavy security, no trouble. But the hush of the yacht, Celia's relaxed demeanor, and those cuffs all screamed that the situation was anything but normal. Still, with the infiltration codes likely on a timer, he didn't have long to deliberate. Fine, he said, stepping closer. Hold still. He clicked the universal key into a tiny recess along the cuffs. Immediately, a swirl of golden light rippled across Celia's wrists. The cuffs detached with a whirring hum, clattering onto the plush carpet. Celia said, flexing her newly freed hands. That felt both relieving and something else. Before Grant could parse her remark, alarms blared through the yacht's corridors. Crimson lights flashed, and a vaguely mechanical voice announced a security breach. Guess that's our cue to leave, Grant said, heart hammering. He motioned for Celia to follow him. Come on, my ship's docked 2 quarters over. She tossed her silver hair behind her shoulder with a mischievous smirk. Lead the way, rescuer. Let's see if you can actually pull this off. They rushed through the corridors, the plush carpeting muffling their footsteps. Occasionally, a defensive drone would zip overhead, scanning for signs of intrusion. Grant steered them through maintenance shafts and past decoy suites, all meticulously mapped out in the infiltration data. Celia moved with surprising agility, never slowing him down, even when they had to crawl beneath rotating sensor arrays or squeeze through narrow junctions. Her eyes gleamed with what looked like excitement. You seem competent, she noted when they paused to bypass a locked hatch. I was worried this so-called rescue might be orchestrated by some muscle-bound mercenary with no subtlety. Grant typed a code into the hatch, forcing it open with a soft hiss. Sorry to disappoint you, he quipped, but subtlety is my middle name, right after cautiously desperate for money. Despite the situation, Celia laughed, and the sound was so incongruous with the klaxons wailing in the background that Grant had to grin. Maybe this wouldn't be as bad as he feared. Then again, alarms always spelled trouble, and he was about to rescue, a major political figure, if the file was to be believed. Something told him the real complications hadn't even started yet. They reached the airlock where the Wayward Sun was docked. The transition from the luxury of the Sovereign Pearl into the chipped metal corridors of Grant's ship was abrupt. Gone were the gilded walls and artistic lighting. Instead, narrow passages scuffed by years of use welcomed them. Celia's curious gaze swept across the Wayward Sun's interior, lingering on half-exposed panels and flickering overhead lights. If she had any reservations, she kept them to herself. Strap in, Grant said, gesturing toward the co-pilot's chair in the cramped cockpit. He flung himself into the pilot's seat, punching a sequence of commands into the console. We need to disengage before they lock down the docking clamps. The old ship groaned as if annoyed by the abrupt departure, but the clamps released. Through the cockpit viewport, Grant could see a pair of sleek interceptors launching from hidden bays on the Sovereign Pearl, each with a blazing red thruster signature. Great, he muttered under his breath. They're bringing out the big guns. Celia's face brightened with something akin to exhilaration. You didn't think they'd let us go unchallenged, did you? She didn't sound particularly scared. Rather, she sounded almost pleased to finally see some action. Grant fired up the main thrusters and banked the wayward sun sharply away from the yacht, weaving between the interceptor's arcs of fire. The ship rattled as blasts sizzled past, some scorching the hull. Could have used a warning that they were heavily armed, he grumbled, hands flying across the controls. Your family must really want to keep you under wraps. She shrugged, bracing herself as the wayward sun lurched to avoid another volley. Don't look at me. I didn't exactly choose to be stashed on a private yacht in the middle of nowhere. Besides, you said you had infiltration codes, right? How else would you have gotten on board so easily? He grimaced, refusing to answer. Truth be told, he wondered how legitimate those codes were now that he'd seen the extent of the defenses. The cloaked informant at the bar had insisted this would be a quick smash and grab, but everything about this screamed setup. The question was, who was setting him up and why? Can you handle a ship's gun console? He asked, slamming the thrusters into overdrive. The interceptors were forming up for another pass. Celia twisted around, scanning the cockpit for the secondary controls. Point me in the right direction. She grinned, a wicked sort of grin. I'm no stranger to a bit of fireworks. Grant flipped on a switch, rerouting partial weapons control to her console. Just keep them off our backs until I can plot a micro-jump. His heart hammered as he typed coordinates into the nav system, hoping to find a blind jump that wouldn't fling them into a star or a black hole. In the corner of his eye, he watched Celia's slender fingers glide over the holographic firing controls. Moments later, bright green bolts streaked out from the wayward sun's underside cannons, forcing one interceptor to peel away. She gave a little whoop of victory. I don't suppose this ship has a cloak. Cloak? Grant snorted. You're lucky it has a functioning airlock. Hang on! He slammed the jump lever, and the stars outside the viewport elongated into endless lines of starlight. In a flash, they hurled into hyperspace. The immediate crisis of the interceptors vanished, leaving only the hum of the wayward sun's engines and the occasional crackle of the battered hull. Grant exhaled a shaky breath. Now mind telling me what exactly is going on here? Celia unbuckled herself, leaning forward. Her teal eyes glowed with an otherworldly shimmer. What's going on is that you've just stepped into a far bigger mess than you realize, rescuer. But don't worry, she flashed that dangerous grin. It's going to be a lot more interesting from here on out. Interesting was an understatement. Not 10 minutes into the jump, Grant felt an odd tingling sensation around his wrists. He glanced down, heart lurching, as golden bands of energy began forming out of thin air, encircling each wrist. They looked suspiciously like the cuffs he'd just removed from Celia. He tried to pry them off, but his hands slipped right through. It was like touching a hologram, except for the faint electric buzz that pulsed against his skin. What the, Celia, do you see this? She stood from the co-pilot's chair, eyes narrowed. A flicker of recognition lit her features. They shouldn't have appeared so soon. Not without... She cut herself off, carefully reaching out. Her fingers hovered above the shimmering rings. Grant, stay calm. Don't force them. Force them? They are on me. He felt something akin to panic, but also noticed that the cuffs didn't seem to hurt. They just were, a presence, a gentle hum that resonated with the ship's systems. What's happening? Celia hesitated. I think the removal of my restraints triggered an ancient bond. I'd heard stories about it, but I never believed them. Those original cuffs were more than just decorative shackles. She closed her eyes as though trying to focus on a distant memory or energy. They're part of a binding ritual unique to my bloodline. Grant let out a disbelieving laugh. You're telling me I just got slapped with some archaic magical chain? That can't be real. She arched a brow. Magic, psychic imprint, advanced biotech, call it whatever you want. The result is the same. You released me from the original bonds, which means the second phase of that bond is now tethered to you. It's complicated. A million questions flooded Grant's mind. Why would her family use a ritual like this? What purpose did it serve? And most importantly, how did he remove it? He took a slow breath, trying to keep his voice steady. So, do these new energy cuffs vanish when we reach a certain distance or something? Or do I need special tools to... She held up a hand, silencing him gently. They're designed to keep us linked. As long as they exist, you and I cannot stray too far from one another without serious consequences. Think of them like a cosmic leash. If we separate by more than a certain distance, it'll hurt. A lot. Grant felt a wave of disbelief. He stared at the glowing cuffs in a mix of awe and horror. You're joking. Celia's lips curved into a rueful smile. I rarely joke about my family's curses, especially the kind that might kill someone if misused. She inhaled softly. But it's more than just a tether. It's also a psycho-empathic link. You might feel some of my emotions, and I might sense yours. In certain conditions, we can even tap into each other's energy. It's not all bad. In fact, for my people, it's considered a sacred union. Union, Grant echoed blankly. You mean marriage? Her small nod was all the confirmation he needed. Grant swore under his breath, sinking into the pilot's chair. He'd accepted a job to rescue a captive aristocrat, only to find himself accidentally, and apparently very thoroughly, wedded to her by an ancient bonding ritual. Celia seemed to pick up on his swirling confusion through the link, because her expression softened. I'm sorry, Grant. I didn't plan this any more than you did. But the instant you unlocked my cuffs, you sort of sealed the deal. He pressed his palms against his face, ignoring the vibrating energy rings. This can't be legal. I never agreed to this. Celia exhaled. In my culture, it's binding. Ironic, I know. She paused, then added, but there are ways out, theoretically. However, they're not pleasant. Grant's mind reeled. Not pleasant was an understatement. Let me guess, someone dies. She didn't deny it, and for a long moment, neither spoke. The hum of the ship, the faint beep of the nav console, and the distant swirl of hyperspace seemed to close in around them. He'd started this day hoping for a quick credit grab, and now he was psychically tethered to a mesmerizing, violet-skinned noblewoman who might have just become his wife. His laugh was hollow. I must be the luckiest idiot in the galaxy. Celia's eyes flickered with sympathy. Lucky or not, we're in this together now. And if I know my family, they'll be coming for both of us. Hyperspace stretched on outside the wayward sun's cockpit, a silent storm of swirling starlight and cosmic dust that formed the backdrop to Grant and Celia's fraught new reality. As the ship settled into its jump, Grant tried to make sense of the invisible tether now linking him to the violet-skinned noblewoman seated beside him. Only moments ago, he'd discovered that removing her golden cuffs had initiated some ancient ceremonial bond, and now his wrists glowed with those same shimmering bands. Neither of them could venture too far apart without experiencing excruciating pain, or worse. To top it all off, Celia implied that her formidable family would be hunting them both, and she wasn't exaggerating. The Celestine Empire, if it truly was her background, boasted a lineage of psionically gifted royals who could bend reality in ways Grant had previously dismissed as tall tales told by drunken spacers. For the first hour of their escape, they worked in tense silence, busying themselves with the mundane tasks of flight, checking the nav computer, scanning for potential threats, and making sure the battered hull of the wayward sun hadn't sprung any new leaks. Each time Grant ventured too close to the cargo bay, an uncomfortable static crackled along his wrists, nudging him back toward the cockpit. Celia, for her part, would casually pretend not to notice, though Grant suspected she could feel the same pull whenever she drifted too many meters away from him. Part of him wondered if she found the entire predicament amusing. Her composure suggested she was used to dramatic twists of fate. Eventually, Grant gave up on avoiding conversation and turned to face her. All right, so these cuffs, or energy bands, or whatever we're calling them, are now part of my daily wardrobe. You said there might be a way to break the bond without, you know. He hesitated. Celia had mentioned death as a possible outcome for forcibly shattering the link. Is there a safer option? She pursed her lips, tapping a finger against her chin. I'm not an expert on the rituals. Few among my people are. since it hasn't been practiced widely in centuries. My mother once told me the original purpose was to ensure that when two individuals formed this union, they would share both life and power. Undoing that union typically meant forcibly severing a piece of the soul itself. She gave a delicate shrug, her teal eyes reflecting starlight. Very unpleasant, rarely successful. Grant swallowed. That's grim. So I'm effectively stuck as your accidental husband unless we want to risk tearing my soul apart. Celia grimaced at the word husband. Our culture wouldn't use that exact term, but yes, the principle is similar. And trust me, this was not my plan. He watched her for a moment, noticing how her shoulders slumped under an invisible weight. She might have been exuding confidence and sarcasm earlier, but there were cracks in her armor. I believe you, he said gently. Look, if we can find a way out that doesn't kill me or you, I'm all for it. But if not, then we'll have to figure out how to live with these, he added, lifting his wrist to demonstrate the faintly glowing band. Her posture relaxed slightly. Thank you, She paused, turning as the ship's console beeped a warning. We're dropping out of hyperspace. Get ready. Grant swung back to the controls, heart clenching. They had no set destination, just random coordinates chosen to shake any pursuers off their trail for a time. As the swirling lights of hyperspace receded, normal stars reappeared on the view screen, and the wayward sun emerged above a sprawling, ringed gas giant with dozens of orbiting habitats. Celia leaned forward, scanning the console. Looks like we can hide there for a bit, maybe refuel. Grant nodded. Agreed. Let's keep a low profile until we figure out our next move. The orbital station was called Ganymede Platform, an ugly metal lattice perched along one of the gas giant's wider rings, but it offered fuel, food, and anonymity for the right price. Perfect for two fugitives attempting to dodge both highborn hunters and cosmic wedding vows. Navigating the chaotic traffic lanes near the station was an ordeal, with hundreds of ships, from tiny shuttles to massive freighters, jockeying for position. Grant almost missed a docking signal that flickered too quickly on his HUD, and he muttered a curse under his breath as he wrestled the controls to line up with their assigned berth. Celia remained quiet, occasionally pointing out an incoming vessel or alarm that Grant might have overlooked. She seemed to adapt effortlessly to the hustling environment, as though she'd studied starport procedures all her life. Then again, if she truly came from a lineage of psionically adept aristocrats, she'd probably traveled more extensively than he could fathom. When they finally latched onto Docking Bay 14, Grant powered down the main thrusters. All right, he said, releasing the flight harness. We'll top off the Wayward Sun's fuel, stock up on supplies, and find a quiet corner where we can talk without everyone's eyes on us. If your family or some other force is looking for you, they might have spread the word throughout these ports, so we keep it discreet. No flashy moves, no revealing details. Got it? Celia raised an amused brow. You act like I've never traveled incognito. I've been dodging familial politics since I was old enough to walk. Discretion is a specialty of mine. Her nonchalance gave him pause. He realized that for all her aristocratic aura, she carried herself like someone who was used to playing cat and mouse with powerful adversaries. It was oddly reassuring. Fine, just don't wander off too far, he reminded her, lifting his wrists meaningfully. We don't know how much distance these things will allow before the shock kicks in. If I try to slip away, we'll both know in seconds. She tapped the band on her own wrist with a wry smile. I'm not eager to test that limit either. They stepped onto Ganymede Platform's docking concourse, greeted by the pungent mix of engine grease, disinfectant, and the faint odor of recycled air. Workers bustled around with loading droids, shipments of raw ore, and crates of questionable contraband. Commercial kiosks advertised interplanetary cuisine and cheap lodging. Overhead, flickering neon signs bore the station's name in half a dozen languages, some of them local dialects Grant barely recognized. As they moved deeper into the station, Grant forced himself to ignore the curious glances. He knew how mismatched they looked. A scruffy pilot in worn cargo pants and a half-open jacket, accompanied by a regal figure in flowing garments that looked suspiciously too fine for a place like this. Celia had at least draped herself in a hooded cloak, but nothing could fully hide her luminous violet skin and silver hair. More than a few passers-by paused to gawk, though none seemed bold enough to confront them. "Head down. Keep walking," he murmured under his breath. Celia complied, though her fingers occasionally brushed the hilt of a small ceremonial dagger she'd brought with her for protection. It glinted once in the harsh station lighting, then disappeared beneath her cloak. They spotted a service kiosk offering short-term ship repairs and refueling options. Grant angled toward it, ignoring the station's chaotic swirl. "Let me handle this," he told Celia quietly. "The less you say, the better." "You think I'm going to blow our cover?" She smirked. "Relax, I'm good at playing the silent sidekick." Grant wasn't sure which aspect of that statement to question first, but he had no time to retort as a thick-set, four-armed attendant emerged from behind the kiosk's counter, already shouting about docking fees. After a prolonged negotiation, during which Grant managed to haggle the docking fees down from absurd to merely high, he confirmed the Wayward Son's fuel top-off and arranged for a cursory inspection of its finicky jump drive. The four-armed attendant didn't bother asking too many questions. Stations like Ganymede survived by not prying into every traveler's affairs, and those who did pry rarely lasted long. Even so, Grant spotted a pair of station security officers strolling near the kiosk, their forms partially obscured by plumes of steam from a vent. Instinct made him step closer to Celia, ready to draw her away if the officers decided to investigate. Once business was handled, they blended into the crowds, heading for one of the station's upper levels where a series of cafes overlooked the swirling bands of the Keys Giant outside. Giant hexagonal windows provided a hypnotic view of swirling storm clouds as far as the eye could see. It was here that Grant finally allowed himself a breath of relief. A few paces from the windows, a semi-secluded alcove offered a scattering of tables. He guided Celia to one at the periphery, where they could observe the passing throngs of travelers without being too conspicuous. A hovering server bot whirred by, depositing 2 steaming cups of something labeled spiral tea. The aroma was bracing. A heady mix of tangy fruit and a sharp, metallic undernote that reminded Grant of station air recyclers. He grimaced slightly at the taste, but welcomed the warmth. The corridor's climate was chill, and the station's overworked atmospheric controls made everything feel slightly damp. Celia cupped her mug, looking reflective. "So," she began quietly, "once we have enough supplies, what's your plan?" Grant leaned back, exhaling as he ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "Honestly, plan A was to drop you off wherever your family wanted, collect my pay, and vanish. But now that I'm your unintentional spouse, I'm guessing that plan's toast." She sipped the tea, her teal eyes peering at him over the rim. "Assuming you'd even want to hand me back to them after all this, which I'm not entirely sure you do." He shrugged, feeling the tug of conflicting loyalties. "I'm no hero, but I'm not heartless. If you're telling the truth that your family forcibly stashed you on that yacht, and you clearly have no desire to return to them, why would I throw you back to the wolves?" He paused, lowering his voice. "I just don't understand what they gain from capturing you. Are you some pawn in a grand political scheme? You mentioned a powerful bloodline." Celia hesitated, toying with the handle of her mug. "I'm from the house of Drothis. My father is, let's say, extremely influential. The empire stands on centuries of tradition, alliances, and a very particular method of passing down power. Lately, the older generation sees me as a potential threat, someone who might shift the balance of that power. The bond you've accidentally activated could grant an outsider, namely you, access to certain psychic abilities. You can imagine how that might terrify a traditionalist dynasty." Grant felt a chill creep down his spine. "So they needed to isolate you, keep you from forging that bond with anyone who wasn't pre-approved. That's the real reason you were locked up." She nodded. "They must have underestimated me or overestimated the security on the Sovereign Pearl. Either way, they clearly intended for me to remain in a ceremonial stasis until they chose a more appropriate match. But your job offer turned everything upside down." A flash of bitterness crossed her face. "Including my own future." Grant absorbed that, drumming his fingers on the table. "So I've become a wild card in your family's carefully planned game. That means they'll hunt us down, or worse." Celia's expression softened. I'm sorry you were dragged into this, but I promise I won't let them hurt you if I can help it. Something in her voice tugged at him, and through the strange new bond, he sensed her sincerity. Before he could reply, however, a commotion at the cafe entrance caught their attention. A group of finely dressed individuals had just arrived. Too many expensive suits and polished boots for a place like Ganymede Platform. At the forefront stood a tall figure with a cybernetic left eye that gleamed silver in the station's harsh light. He scanned the patrons, and Grant's stomach sank. Damn, Grant muttered, recognizing the distinctive glare of that metal eye. That's Varric Crane, old business associate. Grant instinctively slouched lower in his seat, hoping the crowd's hustle would mask him a moment longer. He'd crossed paths with Varric Crane 2 years prior, during a dicey smuggling run that ended with Crane losing a fortune and several body parts to a vengeful creditor. Grant had managed to slip away, but apparently, Crane had replaced his flesh with top-tier cybernetics, built a formidable reputation as a pseudo-legitimate mogul, and never quite forgot the friend who disappeared. "Are you sure he's here for you?" Celia whispered, though her gaze never left Crane's approaching entourage. "About 90% sure," Grant gritted out. "Crane's as vindictive as they come. There's no way this is a coincidence." She pursed her lips. "We can handle him. Let's just slip out." Grant started to nod, but it was too late. Crane's augmented eye swept the cafe and locked onto him. A predatory smirk curved the man's lips. At Crane's signal, his retinue fanned out, cutting off any easy exit routes. "Well, well," Crane said loudly, striding toward their table. His voice rasped with the sort of confidence that came from mixing personal vendettas with lethal ambition. "Grant Cade, of all people, heard you disappeared. For a while I hoped you'd ended up in some backwater prison or spaced yourself. But here you are, sipping tea with a—" His gaze flicked to Celia, narrowing shrewdly. "Lovely companion. Odd place for a highborn to be slumming, don't you think?" Grant stood, feigning a casualness he didn't feel. "Varric Crane, always a pleasure." He forced a smile. "Didn't realize you frequented Ganymede these days. I thought your business took you to glitzier stations." Crane's metal eye whirred, probably scanning Grant's vital signs or analyzing muscle tension. "I go where the profit is, you know that. And I happen to be running a new enterprise now, security solutions, trading ventures, the works. Of course, I was just thinking how you still owe me a few crates of that contraband you ran off with." Celia, who had remained seated, let out a small, musical laugh that sounded anything but amused. Crane's eyes swept her once more. "And who might you be?" Grant clenched his jaw. He couldn't exactly announce Celia's true name or status without drawing more attention, so he settled on, "She's with me. That's all you need to know." Crane's entourage shifted, hands drifting toward concealed weapons. A sizzling tension crackled through the cafe, prompting a few customers to shuffle nervously out of the blast radius. "Is that so?" Crane asked, tapping a metal fingertip on the table's edge. "Because I've been hearing rumors about a certain aristocrat who vanished from a fancy yacht, worth a lot of money if returned to the right people. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" Grant's pulse hammered, but he kept his voice steady. "Rumors, rumors. You know how these stories get around, Crane. Half of them are utter nonsense." Crane chuckled, though there was no warmth in it. "True enough, but sometimes those rumors lead to big paydays." His gaze shifted pointedly to Celia's partially concealed wrist, where the faint glow of the energy band flickered. Celia stood then, the motion so fluid it was almost predatory. "I suggest you find your paydays elsewhere, Crane." She didn't raise her voice, yet the air vibrated with an undercurrent of power. Through the bond, Grant sensed the swell of her psychic energy. "Unless you want to test just how much trouble I can be." Crane's smirk faltered. A flicker of unease rippled across his face, and Grant wondered if Crane's cybernetics detected something abnormal in Celia's aura. "You've changed, Grant," Crane said, stepping back. "Used to be you kept simpler company. Be careful you don't wind up over your head." Grant mustered a lopsided grin, blood pounding in his ears. "Never been accused of caution before, Crane." Crane sneered, motioning for his associates to back off. "Next time, you won't catch me off guard." He lingered a moment, as if memorizing every line of Grant's face, then jerked his head and strode away. The tension didn't immediately dissolve. Even as Crane and his entourage retreated, Grant and Celia could feel the eyes of other patrons clinging to them. Some curious, some opportunistic, and a few just plain frightened. Grant's instincts screamed that it was time to vanish. Blowing a run-in with an old enemy was one thing, but doing so in a public space risked word spreading like wildfire. If Crane suspected Celia was the missing noble everyone was whispering about, he might try to sell that information to her family or to bounty hunters who specialized in tracking runaway aristocrats. Celia lightly touched Grant's arm. A zap of awareness traveled through their bond, heightening his sense of her presence. "Let's go," she said, voice low. "We've drawn enough attention." Grant nodded, tossing a handful of station credits on the table for their teas. They weaved through the crowd, slipping into a side corridor that looped around the station's upper deck. The corridor was quieter, lit by flickering panels that cast long shadows over metal walls. Occasionally, a door hissed open to reveal a lounge or supply closet, but there were no more prying eyes. When they were safely out of earshot, Grant allowed himself a relieved exhale. "That could have ended worse," he remarked, pressing a hand to his racing heart. "Crane doesn't make idle threats. I'm guessing he's still furious I never paid him for that cargo job." Celia arched a delicate brow. "Cargo job? Long story, but basically I ended up liberating some shipments of high-value tech from him. Stuff he'd already stolen to begin with, mind you. He took it personally." Grant shrugged, as if that explained everything. Celia's lips twitched. "Well, he definitely suspects something. And if rumors of my disappearance have reached the black market, Crane or others like him might be keen to cash in. We need to be extra cautious." Grant stopped, glancing around the corridor to ensure they were alone. "We need a plan. Laying low here won't last forever. If your family's half as powerful as you say, they might already have eyes on major refueling stations and trade hubs. I suggest we buy some false IDs, switch out the Wayward Son's transponder, and disappear into a sector your family can't easily reach. Maybe the frontier worlds near the Rift Nebula." He paused, studying her expression. A flicker of uncertainty passed across Celia's features. "That might keep us hidden," she said slowly, "but it won't resolve our bond. If the goal is just to survive, sure, running is an option. But if we ever want to break these cuffs, without paying the ultimate price, we might need to confront my father directly. He knows more about the ancient rituals than anyone alive." Grant's stomach sank at the thought of waltzing into the lion's den. Confront the emperor of the Celestine Empire, or whatever grand title he holds? You can't be serious. She gave him a steady look. "You think I'm thrilled by the idea? But if there is a non-lethal way to break the bond, that knowledge would be locked in family archives. Or in my father's mind. Either way, running will only postpone the inevitable, especially if we keep accumulating enemies like Crane." Grant wanted to argue, but the determined set of her jaw told him she wasn't likely to back down. Worse, he felt the echo of her conviction through their empathic link. That subtle sharing of emotions reminded him that, on some level, she believed this was the only real solution. With a sigh, he rubbed his forehead. "So you want us to walk straight into the Empire's core, where your father and his psychic goons can greet us with open arms, or more likely, open plasma rifles, and pray we don't die in the process?" Celia's gaze held firm. "Yes, but not yet," she amended, placing a hand on his chest. Through the bond, her touch sent a comforting wave that steadied his racing thoughts. "We need to prepare. We'll need allies, disguises, and a far better plan than hope they don't shoot us on sight. That starts with us not making ourselves easy targets." Grant reluctantly nodded. "First step, get off Ganymede before Crane decides to come back with reinforcements. Then we can figure out the rest." She withdrew her hand and they continued down the corridor in tense silence, both aware that their next moves might tip the balance between captivity, freedom, and a potential war with an interstellar dynasty. They reached a dingy cargo elevator that led them to the station's lower industrial decks. Unlike the bustling upper concourses, this area was mostly for shipping crates, storing raw materials, and conducting the less glamorous side of station life. The lighting was harsher, the corridors narrower, and the sense of isolation palpable. But it also meant fewer eyes to see them, fewer random station goers who might recognize Celia or put a price on her head. As they navigated past rows of stacked containers, the bond between them flared with subtle shifts of emotion. Grant's nerves jangled, anticipating an ambush from Crane's thugs or from some random bounty hunter. He could sense Celia's own anxiety, though she kept her expression schooled into a mask of regal calm. It amazed him how she could appear so poised despite her precarious circumstances. Then again, living as an imperial scion likely taught her how to hide fear behind an elegant facade. Suddenly, she paused. "Do you feel that?" she whispered, placing a hand on one of the cargo containers for balance. Grant frowned, checking the corridor. "Feel what?" She closed her eyes. "It's faint, but I sense another presence. Psychic energy, maybe, like a ripple in the air." Her teal eyes snapped open. "We need to be careful." Grant tensed, scanning the shadows cast by overhead lamps. The corridor looked empty, but Celia's instincts, combined with her latent abilities, told him not to dismiss her claim. Moving slowly, they crept forward, each step echoing in the hush. At a T-junction, Grant peeked around the corner, and his blood ran cold. A robed figure stood 20 meters away, facing a console on the wall. In the gloom, it was hard to make out features, but the shape of the cloak and the faint, mundane, pulsating aura around this person reminded him of something he'd seen once before. An advanced personal energy shield, typically reserved for high-ranking individuals or those well-versed in psychic arts. Could it be an agent of her family? Celia's hand found Grant's forearm. Through the potted, he could feel her heartbeat spike. "We should double back," she whispered. But as soon as she spoke, the robed figure turned its head. Grant couldn't discern a face beneath the hood, only a pair of glowing eyes. A wave of force slammed into him like a physical blow, hurling him back against the cargo crate. The impact knocked the wind out of him. He heard Celia cry out, saw sparks dance across her violet skin as she fought to steady herself against the psychic blast. Before either of them could react, the figure moved with uncanny swiftness, crossing the distance in a blur. Grant scrabbled for his pulse pistol, but an unseen pressure crushed his arm to his side. He grunted in pain, feeling as though invisible chains clamped around his torso. "You meddle in affairs beyond your understanding," the figure intoned, voice vibrating with a strange echo. "Celia Drathis was not meant for you, pilot. Her destiny lies elsewhere." Grant struggled against the force pinning him, anger and fear coiling in his gut. "Who the hell are you?" he managed, glaring at those glowing eyes. Celia's voice rose, a fierce undercurrent lacing her words. "Release him, or you'll regret it." Even as she spoke, Grant felt a surge of energy welling up through their bond, her power, raw and crackling. The figure turned its attention to her, and Grant felt the psychic grip loosen just enough for him to slip free. He gasped, rolling aside, brandishing his pistol. He fired blindly, the pulses scattering off the robed figure's shield. Meanwhile, Celia seized the moment. She channeled the energy in her hands, which swirled with faint golden sparks reminiscent of the cuff bands. With a cry that reverberated in Grant's skull, she unleashed a blast of force. It collided with the robed intruder's shield in a thunderclap of light, sending arcs of electricity ricocheting down the corridor. The figure staggered, cloak sizzling, but held firm. "Celia Drathis," the figure rasped. "You have no idea what powers you toy with, powers that could reshape empires. Turn back before it is too late." Then in a burst of brilliance, the robed assailant vanished, teleported away by means beyond Grant's understanding. The corridor fell silent once more, save for their ragged breathing. Grant's heart pounded as he rushed to Celia, who sank to her knees, clutching her temple. Wisps of residual energy still crackled around her fingers, and her normally luminous skin seemed paler. He dropped beside her, scanning her face. "Are you hurt?" She winced, exhaling slowly. "I'm fine, just drained. That took more out of me than I expected." She looked at him, concern flitting across her features. "You?" Grant tested his ribs gingerly. They'd probably bruise, but he didn't think anything was broken. "I'll live. Who was that?" Celia shook her head. "An agent of my family, perhaps. Or a rogue son sworn to keep the old ways intact." My father employs many powerful individuals, especially those who vow to protect Drothis bloodlines from impurities. Her lips curled in distaste around the word. That's probably how they see our bond. An impurity. Grant swallowed hard. That was more than just a typical bodyguard. They teleported. They pinned me with a thought. If your father has a whole legion of people like that, she placed a calming hand on his arm, mustering the last of her composure. He doesn't. Teleportation is a rare skill. Whoever that was, they're not your standard soldier. Possibly one of the older families allied with House Drothis. If so, they won't stop easily. Grant let out a shaky breath. Then we need to move. Now. This station is compromised. If that person found us here, more will come. She pushed herself upright, leaning on him for support. Despite the swirling emotions churned up by that confrontation, an odd warmth bubbled through their bond. Relief, gratitude, and something deeper that neither of them was ready to acknowledge fully. Navigating the rest of the industrial deck, they kept their eyes peeled, but the robed figure didn't reappear. At last, they slipped into a service lift that rattled down another level toward a secondary docking ring. There they spotted a dingy corridor that led back to the berth where the Wayward Sun was docked. Just as they emerged into the docking bay, they nearly collided with a cluster of station workers. The workers were busy loading crates of pressed rations onto a transport, paying little attention to Grant and Celia's harried entrance. "Do we have what we need?" Celia murmured, glancing around. "Supplies? Repairs?" Grant nodded, checking the data slate in his pocket. "Fuel's topped, jump drives patched enough to get us where we need to go. Food might be short, but we'll manage. Better than risking more time on this station." He palmed the bay door's access panel. The seal hissed open, revealing the Wayward Sun nestled in its docking clamps, looking as battered and out of place as ever among the station's more commercial vessels. Yet to Grant's eyes, it seemed oddly welcoming, like the last bastion of sanity in a galaxy spinning out of control. They boarded quickly, Grant running a quick system check while Celia took a seat in the cockpit's co-pilot chair, gingerly rubbing her wrists. The energy band still glowed, but the illumination felt less like a shackle and more like a silent reminder of their intertwined fates. He caught her eye, and she managed a small smile, tired but sincere. "You ready?" he asked softly, firing up the thrusters. "As I'll ever be when," she replied, posture stiffening as the hum of engines thrummed beneath them. The docking clamps released with a clank of metal, and the Wayward Sun drifted free of Ganymede platform. Beyond the docking bay's force field, the swirling vista of the gas giant beckoned. With a resolute push on the throttle, Grant steered the ship away from the station's silhouette. "Coordinates?" Celia asked, bracing herself for a jump. Grant inhaled, recalling their conversation about confronting her father for answers. "First, we vanish from immediate pursuit. Then, we head toward the heart of the Empire. Seems insane, but if there's any place we might find a clue about breaking this bond, or at least understanding it, then that's probably where we need to be." Celia said nothing, but her hand drifted close to his, a subtle gesture of solidarity he found strangely comforting. For a few heartbeats, they simply watched the stars through the viewport, neither denying the monumental risk they were about to take. Then, with a decisive flick, Grant engaged the jump drive, and the stars stretched into ribbons of light once more. The Wayward Sun vanished into the infinite tapestry of space, carrying them toward a confrontation with a dynasty that shaped empires and their own uncertain destiny. When the Wayward Sun finally dropped out of hyperspace near the Empire's capital sector, Grant Cade felt his gut twist with apprehension. Outside the cockpit's panoramic window, a vast spread of star lanes crisscrossed the region, each bustling with commercial freighters, imperial cruisers, and diplomatic couriers. Beacon stations transmitted an incessant stream of flight advisories in multiple languages, and orbital patrols zipped by, checking credentials. This was the heart of Celestine power, the territory of House Drothis, among other noble bloodlines. Whether Celia's father ruled as emperor or occupied some other lofty station, one fact was certain. He possessed influence that rivaled or eclipsed any other figure in the sector. Attempting to approach him without official clearance was tantamount to suicide. "Are you sure about this?" Grant asked, voice tight. He guided the Wayward Sun along the perimeter of the main star lane, hoping to avoid direct scans for as long as possible. The false transponder he'd installed back on Ganymede was good, but likely not sophisticated enough to fool the Empire's top-level security systems for long. Celia stood behind the pilot's seat, close enough that the faint glow of their binding cuffs was almost lost in the cockpit's soft lighting. If we want answers, yes. If there's any chance to sever our bond without bloodshed, it'll be here. Her tone was resolute, but Grant sensed her anxiety through the link. He checked the readings on his console. There's a station designated as an official entry point to the capital world. Looks like we'll have to present some credentials just to get planetfall clearance. Celia's lips pressed into a thin line. We don't have the right credentials, obviously. But my father always keeps a specialized docking platform for delicate arrivals. If we could hack their local beacons, broadcast a priority code for House Drothus, we might be escorted there directly. After that, well, we'd be under their watch. Grant gripped the controls more tightly. Escorted. That's one way to put it. More like forcibly guided by armed fighters. She gave a short nod. Yes, but it might beat stumbling onto the surface illegally, only to be shot down. This way, at least we show them we're coming openly, not as fugitives. He flicked a series of switches, redirecting power to sensors. All right, but once we board, we're at their mercy. If your father orders us arrested or something worse, we'll have no chance to escape. Celia exhaled softly, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. The empathic pulse of her touch steadied him. I know, but if there's any scrap of decency left in him, he'll allow us to speak before doing anything rash. It's the best shot we have. Grant nodded, swallowing his reservations. Then let's do it. You handle the override for the local beacon. I'll keep us out of the main star lane. As Celia moved to the co-pilot console, Grant spared a glance at her face. She looked regal, as though preparing for a role she both hated and accepted out of duty. He realized how much she'd grown since that first moment he set foot in her gilded yacht quarters. Her posture carried an unspoken strength, and the bond thrummed with her resolute determination. Whatever greeting they faced on the planet below, she would not run from it. A few minutes later, Celia announced, I'm sending the code now. Sure enough, a signal pulsed from their communications suite. Instantly, Imperial channels lit up with urgent chatter. Unidentified vessel, you are using an unauthorized priority code. Identify yourselves immediately. Grant glanced at Celia. She gave a small, confident nod. This is Celia Drothus, she said, her voice emerging, clear and authoritative. Daughter of Orison Drothus, requesting audience. I carry a matter of grave importance. Let your commanding officer know. I insist on safe passage. The comm line buzzed with startled silence. Then another voice, steadier, came through. We acknowledge. Remain on current heading. Fighter escort inbound. Celia Drothus, you will proceed to docking platform 9. Grant bit down on a wave of rising tension. The final steps of their journey had begun, and there was no turning back. The escort arrived in the form of 2 sleek Imperial interceptors, each painted in dark purple and gold, the official colors of House Drothys. Their streamlined hulls bristled with weaponry, a silent reminder that any deviation from the assigned flight path would end poorly. Grant followed their lead with deliberate caution, letting them flank the wayward sun on either side as they guided him toward the capital planet's atmosphere. Through the cockpit windows, the world below revealed itself, shimmering oceans under pale sunlight, sprawling metropolises that seemed to stretch for hundreds of kilometers, and a swirl of cloud formations reminiscent of swirling galaxies themselves. The capital soared at the planet's center, an interconnected web of towers, palatial structures, and floating platforms. It was equal parts grandeur and threat, its sky filled with blinking aerial traffic. As they descended, Grant noticed a wide circular platform jutting out from one of the tallest palace complexes. Its surface flickered with energy fields meant for docking larger spacecraft, and an array of turrets ringed the perimeter. This was no ordinary landing zone. It was a fortified hangar designed to welcome, or intimidate, visitors of significance. Docking Platform 9, Celia murmured, scanning the readouts. I remember visiting it as a child. My father would receive ambassadors here. It's more a stage than a dock. Public enough to display important arrivals, private enough to conduct discreet interrogations. Grant's mouth felt dry. Sounds lovely. He adjusted the thrusters as the interceptors broke off, circling overhead like silent predators. A shimmering shield parted over the platform, allowing him entry. The wayward sun touched down with a hiss of pneumatics, engines whining into standby mode. The moment the engines stopped, an intense wave of anxiety rippled through the bond, echoing from Celia and rebounding in Grant's own chest. Yet they both shared an undercurrent of grim readiness. This was the confrontation they'd come for. "I'll lead," Celia said quietly. "I'm sure Father has watchers everywhere. Let me speak. If things turn hostile—" Grant cut in. "We leave if we can," agreed. He rose from the pilot's seat, feeling the constriction of the binding cuffs tingle at his wrists. This final test was about more than just severing or sustaining their bond. It was about survival. They walked down the ship's ramp together, stepping onto the polished marble floor of the platform. A retinue of guards with gilded breastplates stood at stiff attention, forming a semicircle around the central dais. Their uniforms matched the interceptor's color scheme, and each guard bore an energy spear that buzzed with lethal promise. At the dais stood three figures. Two were high-ranking officers, judging by their ornate sashes. The third was a tall, imposing man with an aristocratic bearing, his violet skin bearing the subtle shimmer that Celia's did. He wore a long, intricately embroidered cloak of purple and gold, and beneath his calm exterior, power radiated like a tangible aura. Celia inhaled sharply. "Father." Orson Drothus lifted his chin, eyes swirling in a deep teal hue. "Daughter," he said, his voice carrying the echo of centuries of tradition. "You've returned, and with a guest." His gaze swept over Grant, registering the glowing bands on his wrists. Orison's eyes narrowed. "So the rumors are true. You've forged the binding with a common pilot." For a moment, neither Celia nor Grant spoke. The hush that fell was so profound that even the distant hum of the city beyond the palace walls seemed muted. Then Celia stepped forward, head high. "I have, but it wasn't by my design nor his. You sought to prevent it, yet here we stand. The bond is sealed, and we've come for answers. If there's a way to break it without harm, you'll tell us." Orison's gaze flickered. A range of emotions, anger, regret, calculation, flashed across his face. "We shall see," he said, voice low. "Guards, escort them inside. We have much to discuss, and time grows short." The interior of the palace complex was a labyrinth of corridors and grand halls, each more opulent than the last. Mirrored floors reflected the overhead chandeliers, which glowed with captured starlight. Mural-like projections danced across the walls, depicting the illustrious history of House Drothus, interstellar conquests, alliances forged, crowns passed down through generations of psionically gifted rulers. Armed guards were stationed at every archway, their posture rigid, their expressions carefully neutral. Despite the polished glamour, Grant felt an undercurrent of tension, as if the palace itself braced for conflict. The hush of the corridors, the watchful stares from attendants, it all spoke of hidden agendas. Orison Drothus led them deeper into the complex until they reached a towering set of bronze doors. The emblem of House Drothus, a stylized phoenix with cosmic flames, glinted across the metal. "Enter," Orison commanded softly. The doors swung open, revealing a circular chamber with a domed glass ceiling, offering a breathtaking view of the midday sky. Pillars ringed the room, each carved with runes that pulsed faintly with psychic energy. Dominating the center was a raised, circular platform of black crystal, reminiscent of an altar. Celia inhaled sharply, her eyes on the dais. "The convergence chamber," she whispered. "Why here, Father?" Orison paused at the chamber's edge, turning to face them. "Because it is the only place we might resolve this crisis. The bond you share," he said, gesturing to their energy cuffs, "is an artifact of the old ways, old even by Drothus standards. Once awakened, it either strengthens both bearers or destroys them." Grant shot a glance at Celia, then locked eyes with Orison. You could have told her that before confining her to a private yacht in the middle of nowhere. A flicker of controlled anger passed across Orison's regal features. She was meant to be protected, her potential, guided, not tied to the first roving pilot who stumbled upon her. He frowned, voice dropping. And yet, the bond chose differently. Celia's posture remained rigid. You speak as if this was destiny. Grant was sent by someone claiming to act on your orders. Orson's gaze shifted. I neither confirm nor deny that. There are factions within the Empire, some loyal to me, some opposed. Perhaps one faction sought to test Celia's readiness. Or your own, pilot. In any case, fate or conspiracy has delivered us here. He gestured to the dais. Step onto the platform. Only then can we see what has truly formed between you. Grant eyed the black crystal warily. Sounds like a trap. Orson's calm facade cracked, revealing a hint of impatience. If I wished to trap you, I could have done so the moment you landed. He waved a hand at the ring of vigilant guards. I've allowed you to come this far without chains. But make no mistake, to remain in this chamber without stepping onto that dais is meaningless. If you refuse, you'll gain no answers. Celia rested a hand on Grant's arm. Through their bond, he felt her conflicted swirl of determination, fear, and hope. It's risky, she whispered, but I believe it's our only chance. If Father wanted us dead, he'd have done it already. Grant exhaled, steeling himself. Fine, let's finish this. Together they approached the dais, the black crystal reflecting distorted images of their faces. The moment they set foot on it, a rippling hum filled the air, resonating in Grant's bones. From the corner of his eye, he saw Orson raise his hands, chanting words in a language that hummed with raw psychic force. The dais began to glow. Celia squeezed Grant's hand tight. Whatever happens, she whispered, stay with me. Grant nodded, his heart thunderous. Always. Energy flared from the crystal platform like luminous tendrils, winding around Celia and Grant in swirling ribbons of gold and violet. The flickering runes on the surrounding pillars brightened in response, pulsing as though in sync with a universal heartbeat. Grant felt an uncanny pressure in his skull, as if invisible fingers probed his mind's deepest recesses. Beside him, Celia stiffened but didn't recoil. She let out a trembling breath, eyes closed, as if she too felt this ancient power assessing her soul. Orson's voice reverberated through the chamber, speaking incantations older than the Empire itself. The words carried weight, echoing off the dome overhead. Guards and attendants stood transfixed at the chamber's perimeter, their expressions hinting at both awe and unease. Suddenly, Grant felt a surge from within. The binding cuffs on his wrists pulsed, the same energy radiating from Celia's. A fragment of her consciousness brushed his, flooding him with images, memories not entirely his own. He caught glimpses of a young Celia in these very halls, practicing telekinetic exercises under the watchful eye of her mother. Celia slipping away to watch starship landings from a hidden balcony. Celia confronting familial expectations that stifled her spirit. Each memory wrenched at Grant's heart, making him see the world through her eyes. At the same time, he sensed his own memories laid bare for her, the rough edges of his youth on the fringes of civilized space, the wayward sun's failing systems, the corners of the galaxy where he scrounged for work. An unexpected wave of shame overtook him, worried that she might scorn his scruffy life. But he felt no scorn, only empathy, and a flicker of admiration for his resilience. In the midst of this psychic maelstrom, Oreson's voice boomed, "This union is not lightly undone. If you wish to break the old bond, you must sever it here and now. The cost will be dear." "What cost?" Grant managed to shout above the roar of surging power. Orson's face was contorted with concentration, sweat beading on his brow. A life, or a willing release from both participants. But the bond has grown stronger than I anticipated. Only a decisive act of mutual sacrifice can dispel it. For a heartbeat, Grant's mind reeled at the suggestion of losing Celia to secure his own freedom. Another wave of memories, Celia's warmth, her laughter, the strength of her spirit poured through him. He realized that, even if it were possible, he could not turn back the clock and become the solitary drifter he once was. Not after connecting with her in a way that transcended mere chance. Celia's gaze caught his, and he felt her desperation. "What if we refuse to pay that price?" she demanded, voice trembling with effort. Orison grimaced, the swirling energies reflecting off his violet skin. Then you remain bound forever, unless one of you chooses to break it through force, risking madness or death. He lowered his hands slowly, letting the energy swirl unabated. But that is not the end of it. The bond won't merely keep you tethered. It will elevate you, change you. Even now, I sense it deepening your abilities. His intense stare settled on Grant. You are no ordinary pilot anymore. You've started drawing on Celia's latent gifts, fueling them with your own vitality. This synergy can grow, become unstoppable. Grant's mind reeled, remembering how he'd briefly commanded that robed scion on Ganymede to leave. The single word had wielded inexplicable force, as though reality responded to his voice. He'd attributed it to luck or adrenaline, but maybe it was a glimpse of what Orison described. The dais crackled, sending arcs of energy lashing out. Celia cried out, doubling over as a torrent of power slammed through the link. Grant felt it too, a blazing current threatening to overload his senses. Without thinking, he wrapped an arm around her, anchoring her to his side. "Stop this," Celia shouted through clenched teeth. "We came for a choice, not to be battered into one." Orison's eyes flickered with sympathy and something like paternal regret. There is no easy path. The bond is awakened, and it will either consume you both or lead you to reshape your destinies, perhaps even the Empire's. Grant ground his teeth, struggling to remain upright. He thought of simply demanding that Orison shut this ritual down. But deep in his gut, he sensed the truth. This power, once unleashed, was not so easily bottled back up. It demanded resolution. Tremors coursed through Grant's limbs as the dais continued to surge. The choice, it seemed, wasn't merely about flipping a switch and dissolving the bond. Instead, it required a definitive act of intention from both him and Celia. Either accept the bond wholeheartedly, with all its consequences, or reject it and pay the inevitable blood price. A swirl of golden sparks encased Celia's body. Even her silver hair lifted as though in a gravity-defying breeze, eyes shining with that eerie teal light. Through the link, Grant sensed her heart pounding. Anger, love, fear, hope, all churned together until it was impossible to isolate one emotion from the other. He realized he was feeling them as keenly as she was, the boundaries of their separate selves blurring in the flood of psychic energy. Finally, she twisted in his arms, looking up into his face. He saw tears forming at the corners of her glowing eyes. "Grant," she whispered, "we have to decide. This is bigger than us. If we choose to keep this bond, it might change the balance of power in the Empire and in ourselves. But if we break it," he finished the thought grimly, "we risk losing what we've discovered. Maybe even each other." His throat tightened. I don't want to lose you." Her breath caught. In that moment, the tide of psychic energy around them seemed to slow, giving them a bubble of clarity. "Then we choose each other," she said simply, tears cutting paths down her cheeks. "No matter what comes next." Grant felt a surge of undeniable certainty. He might have been a drifting smuggler his entire life, but in the weeks since rescuing Celia, his world had shifted from survival to something bigger. It was terrifying and invigorating all at once. For the first time, he had someone to stand beside, someone who understood him, truly, intimately. He nodded, drawing her close. "We accept it. Together." Celia's lips curved into a trembling smile. She turned her gaze toward her father, who stood at the chamber's edge like a ringleader presiding over a cosmic performance. "Can you help us stabilize the bond, Father? Without forcing us to kill anyone or reduce this palace to rubble?" Orison's expression was unreadable for a moment, a storm of emotions behind his regal mask. Then with deliberate steps, he approached, every inch the stern monarch. Yet something in his eyes told Grant he was not without compassion. He placed his hands on their shoulders. "So be it," he said gravely. "Lower your defenses, both of you. Let the dais's power complete the ritual in its new form." Grant braced himself. Any lingering fear or doubt he might have felt melted into the shared conviction that they would not be torn apart. He squeezed Celia's hand, and she squeezed back. Together they opened themselves to the swirling energy. A torrent of psychic force poured into them. But this time it didn't slam them with conflicting intentions. Instead, it merged with their joined resolve, forging a network of luminous filaments across the dais. The previously chaotic arcs harmonized, creating a radiant field that enveloped the couple in a gentle glow. In the hush that followed, Grant sensed an electric shift in his perception. The palace walls, the pillars, even the faint heartbeats of the guards on the perimeter. He felt them, like distant echoes. Celia's presence in his mind was no longer a swirl of confusion, but a steady, comforting light. The binding cuffs on their wrists shimmered, then dissolved into dust motes of pure energy. Gasps sounded around the chamber. Orison exhaled sharply, relief and a hint of wonder in his voice. You have forged a new path, both of you. The bond is no longer a chain, it's a choice freely made. The hush lingered, broken only by the faint crackle of dissipating energies. Guards shifted in uneasy awe, their once hostile stances softening. Through the glass dome, sunlight cast shifting rainbows on the black crystal dais, amplifying the chamber's sense of wonder. Orison helped Celia and Grant step down from the platform, but the hum of latent psychic power in the air hadn't fully vanished. It radiated around the pair like a subtle aura, strong enough to make some attendants avert their eyes. Grant released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Testing his wrists, he found no sign of the golden cuffs. Instead, he felt the intangible thread of connection to Celia. Still there, but now it felt natural, like a pair of hearts beating in sync. Celia lifted her gaze to Orison. Thank you, she said softly, though her voice carried a quiet reproach. If you had warned me sooner, perhaps we could have avoided all the strife. Orison inclined his head. My intention was never to cause you pain, daughter. Traditions can be burdensome, and some truths are deemed too dangerous to speak openly. But perhaps you needed to discover your strength on your own. The Empire has grown stagnant under the weight of old rituals. We are all trapped by legacy until someone breaks the cycle. Grant couldn't keep the edge from his tone. That's exactly what nearly got her imprisoned, and nearly got me killed. It's also how we ended up walking blindly into a forced bonding. He paused, wrestling with a surge of anger. If you manipulated events from behind the scenes, you put both of us at risk. Orison gazed steadily at him. This empire is built on centuries of layered politics, alliances, and expectations. A direct approach is rarely possible. I cannot confirm or deny every arrangement, but I will say this. You, Grant, have proven yourself. Surviving and stabilizing the bond was no small feat, and it reflects your devotion to my daughter. A small, mirthless smile touched the corner of his lips. I expected you to break under pressure or to run at the first sign of danger. You did neither. Grant bit back any further accusations. The man's words, though terse, carried a rare acknowledgement of respect. I did what I had to do, he said finally, and I'm not planning on giving up on her. Nor I on him, Celia added pointedly. Father and daughter locked eyes. Something unspoken seemed to pass between them, a tentative step toward mending old wounds. Finally, Orison gestured for the guards to stand down. Summon the court, he said in a commanding voice that echoed throughout the chamber. Let it be known that Celia Drothus and Grant Cade have completed the binding in a new form. They stand under my protection. At once, the guards moved. Some hurried off to spread the word, while others remained to maintain a respectful perimeter. Palace attendants rushed in with medical scanners and tapestries to tidy up the dais, though no one dared approach too closely without Orison's explicit invitation. Celia and Grant exchanged glances. They both understood that this wasn't the end, merely a new beginning. The Empire would have a lot to say about an unorthodox union that bound royal blood with a roguish pilot. Politics would shift. Factions would form. Some would celebrate the modernization of ancient traditions, while others would balk at the perceived tainting of pure lineage. Through their restored bond, however, Grant felt Celia's unwavering resolve, and he reciprocated with a sense of reassurance. Whatever storms awaited them, they'd face them together. In the weeks that followed, life became a whirlwind of ceremonies, political negotiations, and awkward introductions. Once the court learned that Celia and Grant's bond was both permanent and sanctioned by Orison, the imperial media descended like vultures on fresh carrion, though not all coverage was negative. Some tabloids spun a romantic tale of forbidden love triumphing over archaic customs. Others screamed scandal, claiming this was the first step toward dismantling the traditional power structures. Even so, the empire buzzed with a rare, crackling excitement for something genuinely new. Grant found himself navigating elaborate banquets he never dreamed of attending, let alone starring in. Court officials would corner him, each with a different angle. Some wanted to flatter him for political favor. Others demanded he stay out of empire affairs altogether. It was exhausting, but with Celia's guidance and her hand to hold under the table when he felt overwhelmed, he managed to muddle through. Beneath the surface, he wrestled with the changes in himself. Spontaneous bursts of telekinesis or flashes of psychic insight caught him off guard. A stray emotion could make objects tremble or dim the lights around him. Celia taught him the breathing techniques she'd used as a child to control such abilities. She gently reminded him that mastery wouldn't come overnight, but every day he progressed a bit more. Sometimes, after exhausting audiences or maddening dinners, they would sneak away to hidden palace courtyards to train in private, practicing small demonstrations of telekinesis on floating candle lanterns or conjuring illusions in the twilight air. For her part, Celia struggled too. Many courtiers who once dismissed her as a convenient political pawn now watched her warily, aware that her bond with Grant amplified both her powers and her influence. She faced them with surprising poise, refusing to let old insecurities resurface. When the pressure of expectations threatened to crush her, Grant was there, bolstering her spirits in ways both subtle and profound through the link they shared. Meanwhile, Orison seemed content to observe from a distance, seldom interfering. Perhaps he recognized that fatherly meddling would only breed more resentment. Or maybe he was genuinely curious to see what would become of this unorthodox couple who had already rewritten a significant piece of Dratha's tradition. Occasionally, he summoned them both for private discussions in the convergence chamber, though these were less dramatic than the initial ritual, focusing on how best to integrate Grant's new abilities into the Empire's delicate tapestry of power. One evening, under a sky tinted gold by the system's setting star, Grant and Celia stood atop a balcony overlooking the sprawling capital. Star cruisers and civilian craft glided among skyscrapers that twinkled with a million lights. Turrets and watchtowers dotted the horizon, silent reminders of the Empire's might. Yet, in the hush of that moment, the city's grand symphony of activity receded, and it felt as though the entire world was just for them. "I used to dream of leaving all this behind," Celia admitted, resting her head on Grant's shoulder. The swirling patterns on her violet skin glimmered, as if reflecting her mood. Every palace wall felt like a sui. Then fate, or your hooded benefactor, thrust me into your life, and we found a different path altogether. Grant wrapped an arm around her, the warmth of the bond humming between them. "Funny, I always wanted to see the wider galaxy, make some quick money, and never stay in one place for too long." He paused, chuckling at the irony. "Now I'm part of this dynasty, bound in a way I never thought possible." She turned her face up to his, and the intensity in her teal eyes made his breath hitch. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "The bond, the changes, the risk?" Grant brushed back a strand of her silver hair. "Not for a second," he replied, voice low and certain. "Not if it means being by your side." Celia closed her eyes, a small tear escaping down her cheek, though the smile on her lips was radiant. The city lights blinked around them like 1,000 silent witnesses to their moment of quiet joy. Looking back on their journey, from the cramped cockpit of Grant's old ship to the lavish halls of the Drathi's palace, it's clear that unlikely bonds can spark incredible transformations. What began as a forced ritual became a bridge uniting two individuals from vastly different worlds, each growing stronger through the other's courage and heart. In forging a new path, Grant and Celia discovered that true power lies not just in psychic gifts or imperial titles, but in empathy, loyalty, and a shared dream for a better tomorrow. Their tale reminds us that even the most daunting chains can become threads of hope if met with openness and resolve. Thank you for traveling with us to this interstellar realm of cosmic dynasties and life-altering choices. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Please share your favorite moments, theories, and ideas in the comments. Together, let's keep the spirit of adventure alive and inspire many more stories among the stars.